Hello, everyone. A long time ago, David Hardenbrook, one of my viewers, wrote to me and asked me to cover this topic. This is going to be a rookie tutorial about deployment, and there's going to be a little game in it for you viewers. And that will take place at the end, and you should write in the comments what your thoughts are. And I will try to respond to everyone that writes something in the comments for that. So, write a comment. But before we do that, I'm going to do my usual. I have a huge PowerPoint. I'm going to go through it, so please feel free to grab a drink and sit down or take a long walk. Here it is as just a podcast with just the sound. I'm going to talk you through deployment thoughts and what it is that goes into deployment. I'm not going to tell you exactly how to deploy for anything, and I'll get back to that. Why I'm doing what I'm doing. So this is going to be it, and there we go. Rookie tutorial about deployment, and I guess there's something in this for non-rookies as well. At least these thoughts are what I use myself as well. So the disclaimers here. This is mostly based on the questions that David sent me. So it's not a direct response, although there will be a direct response at one point to David. But you could approach this from different angles. I guess you could, and it's definitely approached from my angle as the competitive side of bold action. I am a competitive player. I will not go into reasons why you would deploy for thematic reasons. I'll go into this as a game, as you're deploying your game pieces on a board. What do you need to think about? That is what I'm doing here. I think I have quite a good expertise in this topic. I'm not necessarily the best in the world at this, but we have been training in the Danish WTC team quite extensively on deployment. It was one of the first things that we really got into and trained on. And I'm going to show you the method. I've had this featured on my channel before, so those who've seen a lot of my videos will maybe remember this one. The training methods and the thought process about deployment and what you should deploy and how you should deploy, I think, fairly good at this. And that's me trying to be objective. I'm not trying to blow my own horn or anything. I'm trying to be objective about this. I think I am quite good at this. Right. So when you're deploying, there's a lot of things that you need to take account for. There are the deployment possibilities, so what you actually can do in that mission. So you can have reserves, you can have first wave, you can deploy, you can forward deploy, maybe even you can outflank. There's a lot of different things that you can do. And the question I think you have to ask yourself is, should I? Do I have the right tools for that? You also have to take into account preparatory bombardment, which in some scenarios can really mess up deployment. And in some cases, I've seen preparatory bombardment actually lose people games. So you have to take that into account. A lot of people also take into account the units and their roles, what it is that they want them to do. Some people very simply figure out what it is that the optimal terrain is for a unit, and they find that on the table and place their unit there, which is a way to deploy. It's not what I would recommend, not how I use it myself, but it's something that many people do. And it's possibly the first thing that you learn that, my howitzer likes to be in behind this type of terrain or whatever, right? It needs to have an open line of fire before it. And then that's what you do. You also have to consider the terrain on the table very carefully, because I think that you can go that route of deploying optimized for the terrain, but You could also just view terrain as possibilities of hiding troops. And different terrain calls for different types of deployment, if you know what I mean. Two final things. There's the mission and there's the enemy. Now, for missions, you want to deploy so that you are actually contributing to figuring out that mission. And the enemy army list, that and what that wants to do will also inform your choices of deployment. For a good example of this, go and watch my video on my second game at the WTC, maybe even my first as well. I was playing against two of the top players, Manuel and Achilles, and both of them looked at my list and chose to outflank me because they knew they couldn't take me head on. My troops were simply better. They were equipped to deal with the enemy infantry, so they chose to outflank me. So that is taking into account the enemy army list and what do I need to do then. Right, so let's get into it. First I'm going to talk you through the different how you deploy different things. So there's one method that's called dice in bag. That's when you have your order dice, you put them in a bag and you draw out order dice and you set down your units as the dice come out, right? What you want to have happen there, and you can't control this, is you want to go last. Because if you go last, then you can counter deploy. You can see where the enemy has deployed and you can sort of say, okay, I want to be there, I don't want to be there. And that can be really, really strong. If you can't get that, I would suggest that if your order dice come out first, I would suggest deploying unimportant stuff first. So stuff that you're not going to use to win, that you just need deployed somewhere, and you use extensively. You try to use line of sight blockers and cover, because if the enemy is going to shoot at you because they have counter deployed, you're going to be at a disadvantage. So you're going to need to have as much cover as you can get, preferably where they can't even see you. So that's the thing that you need to consider with dice in bag. If you're going to run first wave, then I would suggest bringing on the units first that you need to fight the game, especially units that you need to maybe damage the enemy's army. So if the enemy has lots of tanks, bring on your anti-tank assets. If the enemy has lots of infantry, bring on your anti-infantry assets. If they have lots of artillery, bring on your long-range Daka assets so you can pin them down and start giving them casualties. Because this first wave is an opportunity for you to focus your force against the enemy, what it is that they have the most of. And it's also a chance for you to counter the enemy, sort of see where they deploy their tanks or whatever, and then push in and counter that. So for me, I always try to look at my enemy's army list and then figure out what it is I need to counter that army list. What is my enemy? What do they want to do? And how can I hurt that part of their army that they want to deploy? That is how I would play first wave, and what mentality I would approach first wave with. Reserves. Reserves is when you say, okay, I'm holding this in reserve. They can come on from turn 2. You need an order test to bring them on. That order test will, for most armies, be at -1. Which means that you lose at least 1 turn of that unit on the board. Which means that you're going to have to think about whether or not reserves are even necessary for you. For most of my games, I will simply not reserve anything because I'm losing a turn of that unit being active on the game board, and I don't want that. There's no reason for it. Most often, there's no reason. Sometimes there can be a reason, especially if you have counter units like a bazooka and a jeep, for instance. Then that unit is going to want to stay out. It's going to want to see the enemy's tank deploy first, so that you can bring on your jeep later and get the bazooka out and shoot. Also remember that if you have units in a transport, your lieutenants, if they sit in that transport, will actually give their morale bonus to the order test to bring on the transport, which is kind of nice if you have that bazooka jeep. Sometimes I've seen some people keep their scoring units in reserves, but that's mostly when you have to keep stuff in reserve. You keep them in reserve, then bring them on later game, where they can come on, and you have to bring them on at a certain point so they can reach objectives, right? But in general, I would question if this is even worth it. If there's enough terrain on the table, I would suggest that it's possibly not worth it. I would suggest that you should maybe just have your game pieces on the board most of the time, unless you have a specific counter unit. Right, that was reserves. Outflanking. I never outflank, but I have been in trouble because of enemy outflanks. So, yeah, units that do it well. That is what I would outflank with. Don't do it with everything. Don't do it with assault units. Don't do it with just plain old infantry units. There's no reason to do it. Don't do it with your main units that are going to damage the enemy. That's not what's there for. There are certain units that outflank especially well and can bring devastating effects onto the table. So the units that do it well are full strength units, because they can re-roll their test. If they have special rules for outflanking, some units do, British Chindits for instance, or if you have a lieutenant being transported with that outflank, that means that you have a bonus to come on from the outflank. That is good. Typically what I'll see is you bring a Panzerfaust, like a single Panzerfaust, and you hope that the enemy has deployed their armored assets near that edge where you're outflanking from. Or you have a Flamer and a Jeep. That was also a classic outflank, and I've actually lost games because of a Flamer and Jeep in outflank that I couldn't kill when they came on. I knew they were coming. God damn you, Andrew McKay. And you can do objective grabbing or contesting with this. This was done to me at the WTC last time by Manuel, who had a full strength unit that came in from the outflank and contested and eventually took an objective from me. But most of the time your outflank is just there to bring a little bit of shock and awe and damage something and then go down or die. And you have to, because it's like that, you have to pick your moment. You have to pick the exact right moment for that outflank to be effective. Be aware of enemies that are on ambush. Be aware of enemies that you can't hurt. Be aware of, any assets that might stop your outflank, basically. And also be aware of how far down the line your outflank can go. Two final thoughts. One, you'll lose at least 2 turns, and most likely 3 because you want to be pretty far up the board before you spring your outflank. So you're going to have to figure out if it's worth doing or not. Some people think it is and can make it work. I suggest you train, because it's not easy figuring out that exact right moment to do the outflank. Final thought. What was it? I lost it. I had an idea. Yeah, it's gone. I make it back to that. Right. What about forward deployment? Yeah, forward deployment is really good for early board control, but it does put your units at a risk. So especially in kill point missions or missions where the enemy is really good at killing forward deployers, with if it's small teams, they've got snipers or they've got assaulters or something like that, something that can reach out and do nasty stuff to your forward deployers, then I wouldn't forward deploy. In objective missions, forward deploying is really beneficial. So only units with the forward deployment special rules can do this, or if you have like US Rangers that have a move before the game actually starts, you sort of get the same effect. And you do it when you want to go. And when you do it, you want to go first for board control, because placing that first forward deployer, you roll off, and the person who wins gets to set up the first forward deployer. Normally, I would go last because I don't want to contest the center board from the start with most of my army builds. But if you want to do that, you want to go first because you'll immediately have control over where you place them, and that will push away enemy forward deployers from that area. So if you have an objective in the center, put your forward deployers there, the enemy cannot come near it. That's good. For snipers, you want to go last though, because snipers will want to set up where they can counter deploy small teams and shoot them. You're also going to want some cover because forward deployers are immediately under threat from the enemy army. So that can be a problem. Last thought, remember, you don't need to leave your deployment zone with forward deployers. They can be set up in your own deployment zone after all the deployment. You don't need to push out into no man's land. The only times when you need to push out into no man's land is when you want to contest objectives, or if you've got preparatory bombardment, because most forward deployers are small teams. Really not nice to have them in your own deployment zone when there is preparatory bombardment. So that was the different ways in which deployment can, what you need to think about for different types of deployment. Now I wanted to go over with you one mission as an example. I'm going to go over No Man's Land. So if I look in the book, and you can pick your own rulebook up and look, it's on page 134. The setup for No Man's Land. Both players roll a die, the highest score picks a long table edge and declares which of his units, if any, are being left in reserve. So the first thing you have to figure out is, do I want reserves? Now, one thing that may make you want to reserve something is that there is preparatory bombardment for No Man's Land. So all vehicles, all small teams, all single miniatures are under real threat of being one-shotted by preparatory bombardment. So what I'll typically do is I will say, okay, for my reserves, I want my vehicles to go in reserve, and all my small teams, they'll go in one of my transports in the reserve with a lieutenant. I'll start by doing that then. And it says here, this can be up to half the units in your army rounding down. So I'm going to need to check that I don't, because sometimes you need to put that one truck or that one AT rifle down on the table, and you can't do anything about it. You're going to have to do it. Right. The other player does the same. Once both players have declared reserves, they deploy their other units by dice in back. So you take the rest of the dice, those that are not in reserve, plunk them down, and then you deploy. And as I said with deployment before, you want to go last, or put down stuff that is unimportant for the mission. In this case, it's a kill points mission, so put down stuff that can't really kill anything. What you don't want to do if you have direct shooting like artillery and stuff, AA guns, you want to put them down at the very last order dice, because you want to have fields of fire where you have an enemy in your sights from the start. That's the best thing. If you deploy them early on, then the enemy will simply counter deploy and move away from that line of sight, which could be a thing, but isn't necessarily. Right. After that, continue to do this until all units not in reserve have been set up. Right. After that, there is forward deployment. So if I have any forward deployers, I would want to put them down. I'm not sure I would want to do this in this one, although typically I'm playing British, so I will have a free artillery observer. He will go down, not in my own deployment zone, because there's preparatory bombardment. So I'll deploy him 1 inch, like 1/2 inch outside of my deployment zone in total line of sight blocking cover. Why total line of sight blocking? Because I don't want him to be sniped. So if the enemy has a sniper, I'll immediately place him somewhere where the enemy can't see him, and then move out once I know where the sniper is deployed. If he doesn't have a sniper, doesn't matter. I can deploy him anywhere. So that would be my suggestion. Would I outflank for this mission? Typically not, but I might have a flamer in a jeep with a lieutenant that could go in outflank. But not necessarily. That would be my example of how I would go through a mission and decide on deployment. Now, what I would typically do when going to a tournament is I would go through all the missions and do this in advance. I would simply write down what my typical deployment would be for this mission, because that quite often doesn't depend that much on the enemy's army, although on some armies it does. And that means that if my enemy has a lot of armor, then I'll make one plan. If it has a lot of infantry, I'll make another. Yeah. So back to David's questions. Question 1: which units tends to be better for reserves? Better for reserves are counter units. That's the best thing to have in reserves, or units that you have to have in reserves because they're under threat, right? But counter units, like I said, units that counters a specific unit in the enemy's army, and the enemy might not plot that unit down on their deployment, so you want to see where it goes before you deploy them. So keep them in your reserve. What fraction of a list in general do I hold back? None. Not a thing. If I can avoid it, if there isn't preparatory bombardment, if there's enough terrain for me to hide behind, I will always deploy everything. I don't want to have to roll that order test, because once you roll dice, things can go wrong. I would rather have my assets on board and ready to go, always. So yeah, that's just me, maybe. Write in the comments if you disagree with me, if you think that you would have reserve for other reasons, but I don't typically. Question number 3: do you try to cover the whole width of the board or stay grouped? I will never, ever try to cover the whole width of the board unless I'm doing so very, very deliberately. I always try to group up my army, or at least make sure that I can in one move have my army grouped. Why? Because typically I will want to hit 1/2 of an enemy, and if you're deploying broadly across the whole board, you are immediately setting yourself up for that concentration of force on one flank. This is because I think I learned this playing. I played 40k for quite a while, and I played Eldar jet bikes. And when you're playing that, there's a tactic called a swing wing, where you swing towards one flank. And I've sort of replicated that in bold action, and you can replicate that in bold action. With your vehicles, with your troops, you can just swing out to one flank. And what that does is you're fighting against 75% of the enemy's army. You're suddenly outnumbering the enemy quite badly, and that will mean that you win. So try not to spread out. There is, of course, always a caveat, and that is the enemy having multi-rocket launchers. If you come together too much and he has multi-rocket launchers, that's a problem. So which units do I tend to deploy before others? I tend to deploy units that are not going to do anything. So my lieutenants that are inexperienced, my trucks, or if I have a horse-drawn limber, stuff like that, that goes down first because it's not useful. It's not going to do much during a game. So that will go down. Then I'll deploy units that can really move. So if I have like motorcycles or cavalry, because that can always change flanks, right? And if I want to sort of lure my enemy into deploying a certain place, I will sometimes put down that stuff, put it on a flank, and then know that I'm not going to go to that flank, and then pull it back towards myself, turn one, and then push the other flank. Are there deployment mistakes from your enemy that you look for? Yes, always. I look for my enemy to deploy fixed assets that are deployed in a manner where he can't see where I want to go. That is what I want. Because as soon as he has something fixed that's locked down in an area, that 100 points or 50 points or whatever it is, if it's a howitzer, that can now not influence my army. So I will look and see where he puts down fixed assets, and then I will go to the opposite flank, so that fixed asset is not effective. In my game against Achilles at the WTC, go and watch that video, Achilles' fixed autocannon, he had an AA gun, didn't shoot once, not once, because it had no targets. I had put down a recce jeep on that flank to lure him into doing that, and I wrecked a few times when he shot at me, but he didn't get to roll a single dice for that, and that was what I was intending. I wanted him to put it down where he could not influence the game. Now, a question you didn't ask, David, is how do I get better at this? There are a couple of ways. One, play games, lots of games. Over time, you will figure out what it is that you like doing and what works for you and what doesn't. So play games, lose a lot. That's the first thing. I also think that you should start making plans for missions. So sit down, if you're going to an event, sit down, take a piece of paper, print the pack, for crying out loud, print out the pack. Here I have my pack for Seal and Open, which is a tournament I am TOing in a few weeks. And what I would do is I would simply turn to the pages where the missions are. Here is my key positions. On that page, I would simply scribble down notes for myself. How am I going to play this mission? How am I going to deploy for this mission? So make a plan. Sit down, do some meta thinking about that and write it down. Once you get to the table, once you see your opponent, you should revise that plan a little, but not much. And the final thing that I would suggest is turn zero training. I've done this before. I will talk you through it and we can do it together in a minute. Turn zero training is basically where you have a trainer that tells you get this mission, you get this army list, and you get this table. What are you going to do? And then you make a plan. You write down what is your plan. Where do you want your assets to go? Where do you want to go in reserve? What do you want to put in Dyson bag? Where do you want to deploy your units? Where do they want to go to win the mission? All of that, you write that down. And the trainer, in this case, I will try to train you, will give you feedback. I think that's a good idea because whatever. Once you do that, sometimes you start becoming better at this. You start making fewer mistakes at the actual tables. I know a table is not the same as sitting down and thinking and writing, but you make fewer mistakes once you have done this. So let's do some turn to zero training, David, shall we? Now, here is the mission. You're playing double envelopment. Go get your rule books, read up on double envelopment. Your opponent is a 15 order dice Soviet list. It's played by a good player. Imagine it's played by me. It's got a Docker Steward. It's got 2 Bren carriers with engineers in them. It's got dog mines, 3 of those. It's got an M30 multi-rocket launcher. Go read up on that one. And it's got 15 order dice, so quite a lot of order dice and good assets in the lists. I'm not going to make the list in detail. Just imagine that that is what you look at the list and say, wow, okay, that, The table, I'll show you in the next slide, and you are on your left side. So take the picture and you're on the left, I'm on the right. Write in the comments, what are you going to do? What are you going to, how are you going to place your troops? What's going in the reserves? What's going on the table? Write down everything. What's your plan? Reserves, forward deployment, first wave, Dyson bag, everything. Write it all down. I will give you feedback on your comments. Go do it. And I will see you in the comments. Here's the table. It's a city table. So you are on this side. I am over here next to my head. I will keep it up for a few minutes. You can also pause the video. I would suggest you take a screenshot of the table and just paint in where you want to deploy your stuff. And use whatever list. It doesn't matter. It's 1,000 points. Use whatever list you want to use. It doesn't matter for me. Use the list that you want to train with. And yeah, I will see you in the comments. David, thank you so much for this. It was nice to be back in the tutorials game. And I hope some of you will comment on the Turn Zero training. Right. See you in the comments. Cheers.